I'm going to start. There are some handouts in the back if you want to grab one. It's actually, I took it off of the website for First Unitarian Universalist in Ann Arbor. They are already a sanctuary congregation, and they just had some really good resources on their website for questions that their congregants were asking. So I kind of thought, just to get ahead of some of those logistics, if people wanted to take a copy, you don't really need to look over it right now. It might be something you want to read before next week. So go ahead and grab one of those and settle in.
Thank you.
Oh, you got mom and dad here.
I know.
Keep her in line.
I've been told I'm not allowed to use profanity and all that for my parents being
It's never stopped us before,
but good morning. My name is Emmeline. I'm talking about Congregational Sanctuary. At any point, if you have questions, we're a small enough group, I think just let me know. It might be something I'm going to get to later in the presentation, and I'll let you know. Additionally, this is a 3-week series. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the sanctuary movement, its history, sort of its theological understanding in the Christian tradition, and kind of what the current crisis is in a broad sense. Next week we have Mary Ann Perrone coming in. She is one of the leaders of Washtenaw Congregational Sanctuary, and she's going to talk more specifically about what's going on in Washtenaw County, what type of people are seeking sanctuary, what congregations have responded and in what ways. There are multiple levels of response. And she really is a Latin American expert, so she can really answer the question of why are people here, why are they afraid to go back, and just some of those logistical questions. So I'll cover that a little bit this morning just so everyone has a basic understanding, but if you have some of those really technical questions, Mary Ann next week is going to be a really great resource on that. And then I think the plan is the week after that to sort of take the information that we've learned the last 2 weeks and have a bit of a discussion. If there's information we found that we're missing from these 2 weeks that people want for the 3rd week, we can make sure to prep that, but also have a chance to talk. I've also been asked to draw to your attention that these adult ed classes the video is going up on the Zion website. So you can go to our homepage, the zlc-aa.org. And once there, you can go to adult discipleship, click on adult education, and then a page will open up that will have a video archive. So if you're interested in finding some of those, if you wanted to listen to the other presentation that's going on, but you came here instead, you could go find those different things. So yeah. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump into it. So we're talking about congregational sanctuary. There we go. Here are just a couple of headlines around the issue. So in the last really decade, there's been an increase in deportations in the United States. The last couple of years, we've seen an escalation as well under the new administration, and the tactics have changed a lot, which is why it's gotten additional media coverage. But you can see there's a very real fear for a lot of immigrants being deported, that if they are returned to their place of origin, it could be a death sentence for them. This is for a number of reasons. That the conversation has not always been clear when it comes to specifically immigrants from Latin America. So we've heard a lot about refugees the last couple years, but refugees we tend to think about coming out of the Middle East or Central Africa. We don't think of refugees as coming from Latin America. That's because of a lot of complex political issues. When we're allies with the government, we won't say that the people in their country who are suffering oppression at the hands of their government are refugees. That doesn't make for very good politics. So when we're talking about refugees out of Latin America, a lot of people will call them economic refugees, but that's not exactly accurate. Also, one of the reasons that this has become confusing is because the term that a lot of immigrants have learned to describe why they came to the United States is for a better life, for more opportunity, which sounds a little bit less dire than the real situation. Violence in Latin American countries is pretty serious. Mostly it's people being pushed out by drug cartels, oppressive governments, things like that. So it's not just that they wanted to go somewhere where they can get higher pay. It's really a matter of raising their children in a place without, gunshots every night, that sort of thing. So Often also women will come who have been victims of domestic abuse and can find no support in their country. Law enforcement won't assist them in any way, that sort of thing, and they have people after them. They have to find a place to go. That can cause people to migrate. There are a number of different issues, and I'm not, again, Marianne next week can tell you more around those issues, but there are a lot of different reasons that people leave, and a lot of different reasons that people are afraid to go back. Additionally, a lot of people come to the United States and have children, and those children are U.S. citizens, and to be deported would mean to separate them from their family. So that's an added concern. Where it is that they would be deported back to, they don't want to bring their family with them because it's not safe. So it's either a choice of, never see their children again, or bring their children to a place where they don't feel safe raising them. And that kind of brings us into this question of who can get deported and why. I'm sorry, this is a little bit of a delay. And there's some confusion around the language that we use for someone who's undocumented. Most of you know, we'll see if that switches in a minute, we don't use the term illegal anymore, an illegal alien, because no human being is illegal. Each person has a right to exist. That's why we call them human rights. You have a right to be a person. So you can have committed a crime, you can be undocumented, but you yourself are not illegal. So that's no longer a term that we use. Sorry, I don't know why this isn't fine. And even, we use the term undocumented a lot now, but that can be complex too. Most people who are in the United States who maybe don't have permanent legal status are not undocumented. Very few people are sneaking across the border completely undetected. Most people at some point are going to have some type of interaction with law enforcement, or at the border they're seeking asylum, something like that. And so they're going into some sort of legal proceeding, but that takes many, many years. So they're here, they're working within the system, or when they came in legally on a visa and have overstayed their visa. There are a lot of different, sorry, we can't get to my slide, but it kind of shows that legal status in the United States is a spectrum. It's not either you're here legally or illegally. Most people exist, who we're discussing in this sort of presentation, exist somewhere in the middle. So someone who can be deported is someone who came into the country either legally or illegally, but somehow ended up in an interaction with immigration enforcement, and their request for a green card, asylum, all these different things has been denied, and they can be deported, or a permanent legal citizen or legal resident who has committed some type of misconduct. So certain types of crimes, even if you have permanent legal residence, could still create grounds for deportation. That has gotten dicey over the years as well. Previously, certain crimes did not qualify, and then in the mid-90s, there was some immigration reform, and it affected people retroactively. So people who had pleaded guilty of crimes were now eligible to be deported, when before they were not. So that's added a lot of confusion to that dynamic as well. Improper entry into the United States is a misdemeanor, not a felony, which there's also a lot of confusion about. So improper entry would mean somebody who really did show up undocumented. They snuck across the border, as it were. So that doesn't mean somebody who overstays a visa. That's different. But improper entry, you can be fined, or it's a max of 6 months. Most people get fined, and again, it's just a misdemeanor. And then they would enter into some sort of legal proceeding and potentially could be deported after that point. Are there questions about that? No? Okay. I'm sorry, my slide won't move. So that brings me to the question, though, of what is sanctuary? Because that's a term we've heard a lot of, too. Sanctuary campuses, sanctuary cities, sanctuary congregations. So a sanctuary city or sanctuary campus is just a municipality of some kind that has said that they will not have their local law enforcement engage in immigration enforcement. So a lot of the reason behind that is a public safety issue. So if somebody who is undocumented or in the middle of some sort of legal proceeding and doesn't want to have law enforcement interaction, sees something going on, some type of abuse or crime, they won't report it for fear of interaction with law enforcement. And that poses a public safety hazard. So cities that have declared themselves sanctuary cities, often it's to make sure that people feel comfortable reaching out to local law enforcement over issues without fear that then someone's going to ask about their immigration status and potentially get them deported.
Is there a list of where the sanctuary cities are in Michigan, for example?
Yeah, and Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor are both sanctuary cities.
What about Canton?
I don't know. So yeah, I'm sure online there's a list of what cities have become sanctuary cities. And then there's been a lot of conversation about the federal government withholding funding to cities that are sanctuary cities. It's really, really complicated because so much of the money that we get federally is for very specific things. So like making sure that there are street lights on bus routes for children who get picked up by the bus early in the morning. If the federal government were to try to cut something like that, a lot of people would be very, very angry. Why are you punishing my child for, whatever. So things like that, when you hear that stuff in the news, really take it with a grain of salt. Sanctuary city is a complicated concept. Sanctuary campuses get even more complex when there are different things as far as funding. But that's mostly what it means, is trying to make sure that people feel comfortable contacting law enforcement, and that local law enforcement agencies aren't wrapped up doing ICE's job or something like that. They can focus on what it is that they're supposed to be doing. Sanctuary congregations are a little bit different. So various houses of worship around the United States have decided to create space for people who have a deportation order and have a fear of returning to their home country. So it has been a policy of various immigration enforcement agencies to not conduct raids in sensitive locations. Sensitive locations are schools, hospitals, and houses of worship mostly. I think there are a few other as well. It's just a policy, it's not a law. So if somebody is facing deportation, a lot of people will not self-deport. They'll try to avoid that.
There's a long history of sanctuary churches.
Yes, and we'll get into that.
Okay.
But this policy of Immigration and Customs Enforcement is that if somebody's visiting a dying relative in the hospital, they're not going to show up and grab them. It's a sensitive location, and they want to be sensitive to that. They will also not bust down the door of a church to pull somebody out. However, in the last year, there have been instances at hospitals specifically and schools. As of yet, I have not heard anything about houses of worship. But the idea being that as a house of worship, we can provide sanctuary, we can provide a little bit of safety, a space where law enforcement isn't going to bust down the door and pull somebody out. I really can't get this to move. I'm so
Try
sorry.
reloading it.
Oh,
get it
there.
Pick it up. There you go.
Okay. Oh. This is, okay, so this is what I was going to bring up earlier, just that immigration status is something of a spectrum, so, or like legal status, so that can be helpful, I think, for some people to see. And I know all of those terms are a little bit complex. But anyways, yeah, sanctuary, we're just talking about sanctuary campuses and cities versus congregations. But there's a long history of sanctuary for Christians. Back in like medieval Europe, there was a policy that if somebody was accused of a crime, a lot of times justice was very immediate and very brutal. And so if somebody just needed more time, what they could try to do to escape essentially the mob was run into a church. And if you made the mob, an angry mob.
Oh, not the mob.
Yeah.
The mob.
Yeah.
Okay.
You could go into a church, and this was protected by canon law as well as civil law in most places at the time, and it varied significantly, obviously, country to country, that sort of thing. You'd have 40 days where the community had to feed you, and you were able to prepare a defense of some kind, and you would be protected within the walls. After those 40 days, they could still chop off your hands or whatever it was. But the church provided sanctuary. This was used also by a lot of people politically, so, at any given time when someone was in or out of favor, they could, cool things down by claiming sanctuary for those 40 days and get a chance to explain themselves, that sort of thing. In the United States, there's also a long history of sanctuary, and where a lot of the stories of sanctuary that you can find are during times of slavery and the Civil War, and as part of the Underground Railroad, so on, that the place where a lot of people would find safety was in churches, that Christian communities and faith communities would harbor folks who were running, and they would stay and be safe within the church. And that at the time was also called sanctuary. Sanctuary, as we're sort of talking about it today, started during the Cold War largely, though its history comes from a lot of different places. But during the Cold War, when the United States was again supporting certain Latin American powers in order to resist socialist uprisings, a lot of people were fleeing that violence and oppression, and were coming to the United States, and then the government was seeking to deport them, and churches were taking them in. So they would live, again, based on this policy of not going into these sensitive locations. They would be housed in churches. So,
For how long?
so it really depends. So sometimes it can just be a couple of months, again, to prepare a legal defense and that sort of thing. Sometimes it can be a year or more. It really varies.
And then does it mean that when they're in the building, they don't ever leave the building?
That is correct. Yeah.
There was here recently, I guess last year, there was a man and his family, they were deporting him, and he was saying he was within a church. I'm not even sure which church it was, but what ultimately happened then?
Yeah, there's somebody in Sanctuary right now in Detroit. We have another person in Sanctuary in the state of Michigan in Kalamazoo. And I'm actually not sure the numbers for the whole United States, but yeah, often it'll just be one member of a family, so the rest of the family doesn't have to all stay. They have permanent legal status or citizenship. But again, if it's a question of like a father not wanting to leave his entire family behind, can go into Sanctuary and will have to stay within that building. I'm not sure exactly what happened. I think that maybe the story you're talking about, he's still in Sanctuary. But yeah, let me get a little bit into some of those logistics of someone going into Sanctuary. So it is really putting yourself at the mercy of the community. So this fear of deportation, either for your life or to completely leave behind your family, a person would choose to be supported by a congregation or a community by living within the walls of the church. You can't go out to grocery shop. You can't go out to get medical care. It really is a huge step to take. Most people do not want to take that step. They would really like to utilize any other means available because it's extremely limiting to really give up that much of your freedom and mobility. But when people are really faced with that dilemma, occasionally they will choose it as a last resort. It's an opportunity to gain some media attention, which sometimes can help people's cases. It's an opportunity to get some time. There are a lot of different ways that it gets utilized. Congregations that are taking people in are not harboring them. They're not in any way hiding them from the law. It's done very publicly with a press release, so no laws are being broken, which I think is really important to make clear. The way that it tends to be organized is, one congregation will actually take the person in, but often build a network of other congregations who are supporting, who are bringing groceries, or if there's not a place to do laundry on site, taking care of laundry. Have somebody on call if something goes on, making sure that you have some folks with expertise, be it legal, medical, whatever, who are available. So it is quite a process to build a support team around a person going into Sanctuary. In Washtenaw County, we have Washtenaw Congregational Sanctuary, which again, next week, Mary Ann will get more into the logistics of what's going on locally, but it really is building a whole support team. And various congregations have different levels of support. So some will support monetarily. If the family's in Sanctuary, they'll help pay for some food and that sort of thing. Some will supply volunteers. So somebody has to be with the person who's in Sanctuary at all times. You have to have somebody at the church. Again, in case law enforcement shows up outside the door or there's an emergency or anything like that. So they'll provide volunteers, and then some congregations actually host somebody within their walls.
Can we go back to what you said about it's not illegal? Are there any places where a church is bounded by the law not to do this?
No.
So
So it depends on who you ask.
okay, can you explain that a little?
Yeah, and so this is where the handout that some of you grabbed, let me see if I can find what number is it. So certain legal groups, constitutional groups, are saying that you're not breaking any laws, you're totally fine, and they will help defend you in court. The current administration has been saying it's illegal, but it's not. They've not given a clear precedent for where that's coming from. So again, you're not harboring anybody. You're literally just letting them stay in the building, and whether or not Customs, ICE wants to break down the door is their decision. So we wouldn't be doing anything. We're just letting somebody live outside the building.
Because this question has come up, and that's why I'm asking for
Yeah.
clarification. Some people believe that it is illegal to allow people to stay within the church building. Is there something that?
Well, if it were secretive, if we were hiding them,
Okay.
then that would be harboring, which would be illegal.
Okay.
But this is why any congregation that has become a sanctuary congregation has released a press release to make it very clear, yes, this person's in our walls, we're protecting them for these reasons because we really believe that they should be able to stay. And again, that PR is actually a big component of it, that it looks really bad to kick down the doors of a church and pull
So is
somebody
that
out.
what would happen? They would kick down the doors of the church in the middle of the night, or they would come in on a Sunday morning when the doors are open and drag a person?
So they would need a warrant
They would need a warrant.
to pull
Okay,
somebody out.
good.
Yes. Mhm.
Number 16,
Is that where it is?
talks about they need to have a warrant,
Yeah.
and the sanctuary church could not interfere.
Yeah. So yeah, so there's just also, it's just never been done. This administration though, we don't know. You know, they've done a lot of things that not other people have done before. So this is where it's like getting a little bit scary for some folks. Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice is the fiduciary agent or whatever for Washtenaw Congregational Sanctuary. So ICBJ did a little research and basically like, who would go to jail? Like, if it became a situation, who would they come to arrest? Most likely, it would be the president of the board of the Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice. So, Pastor Donnell Weich over at Vineyard Church, probably not Pastor Jim. So, if that helps.
Probably not.
I mean, I'm just not going to say anything that I don't know for sure. Like, again, this is what all, you know, the ACLU and other organizations have said. But we just don't know with this administration. People have tried to predict before and been wrong.
Emmeline, one of the questions that I think about is the church. If the church just gives that person a place, but it doesn't necessarily say, we'll help you with defending yourself in court, or does it?
So that's where Washtenaw Congregational Sanctuary would come in, that they've been gathering all of those resources.
Okay.
So Marianne next week can get more into those specifics of what they can do and what they're really asking a congregation to do.
Okay.
So yeah, so I'm much more, I can tell you sort of like why the movement is happening, why people feel so compelled, and like a little bit of the basics, but Marianne is the expert, and she can really talk about like, what do we have to have in terms of like somebody's ability to bathe themselves within the church, you know, like that's a question that a lot of churches who want to become sanctuary congregations have had to ask. You know, how do we make sure that people can feed themselves, those sorts of things. How do we actually man the doors? You know, who do we ask and let in and let out and that sort of thing, you know, yeah.
I think that, for me, I'm thinking, what really is the responsibility of the congregation if they said, okay, Joe, you can stay here, and we'll put out the PR thing and all that, but then we do have responsibility and legalities too.
Yes, and in this FAQ that you've been handed, like, so Unitarian Universalist is a sanctuary congregation. They don't have anyone living in sanctuary with them, but they are prepared if the need were to arise. Which again, as I said, is a last resort to folks. People do not want to go into sanctuary like this. But it's there as an option. And it's a way of the community showing solidarity with folks who are facing it.
So
They have questions here about like, will our insurance go up? You know, things like that. The answer is no, so good answer. But you can read through that and it starts to give you answers to some of those questions. Yeah.
how does the average person, can I give you an example? Because I have a real sadness about this situation. So I know someone who is undocumented, whose husband was driving illegally because he can't get a driver's license because he doesn't have a social security number. So pretty much all undocumented immigrants can't drive legally for that reason because they don't have a social security number. Okay, so the man is picked up for driving without a driver's license. I'm not sure if he committed any kind of road discretion. We don't know what that situation was. He was arrested, and ICE was called, and he was detained in the Canton jail, Canton City Jail. He's a diabetic. He was in trouble without his insulin. He called his wife to bring him the insulin, which they allowed her to do, but then they followed her out, pulled her over. She also did not have a driver's license, arrested her, released him. Now she's in jail, waiting for some kind of deportation. Okay, this is like 2 cities over. It's not far.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to understand, what does it take for people to A, know about this, and B, rise up to tell the Canton Police Department, what are you thinking? Why are you calling ICE? If you need to give them a ticket, you give them a ticket, let them pay the fine. But they're not. They're calling ICE and putting this woman has 2 little children. And she's behind bars. And she basically traded her freedom for her husband's because he's the one that has the job. So, I mean, it's just like, I've been sick about it, but I don't know what to do. I'm gonna call her up and say, you know, seek sanctuary somewhere else. I mean, I don't know what to do.
And that's where certain communities are stepping up more than others. So Washtenaw County, like, not surprisingly, has some of the most congregations in the state who have said we would step up and be a sanctuary. We're trying to do more outreach into more communities around Michigan, the sanctuary movement in general, but yeah, Canton, it sounds like, it's not really taken on yet. So it really is going to take folks in Canton to get outraged.
But how do they even know about it? Because I know about it because I know the friends who had to raise the bail money to get the guy out.
Yeah.
I know those people. But how would the average person, I mean, would it be in the news? Should they call the newspaper?
Yeah, I think that more media coverage for this is really important. So you saw the headlines at the beginning that were, you know, people who fear death for if return to their home country, that sort of thing. But also there are stories of the way that the system is administered in the United States is just varies so wildly, you know, county to county, the way that justice is administered. And so often with huge mistakes that can have life and death consequences, like what you're discussing. So there are plenty of stories where I've heard where somebody crossed the border and they were seeking asylum. They immediately made themselves aware. Did not speak English. Were given paperwork saying when they needed to appear in court. And there was no date on it, but they didn't understand because they couldn't read it. So then when they went to talk to somebody and try to figure out when they were supposed to go, the person said there's no date, you need to go back and get a date. They went back to get a date. There was no record of them in the system. And so they were told that they had been here illegally and got deported, even though they applied for asylum and were trying to get it. Things like that. Or, you know, people who are taken into custody and then their family tries to come visit and they find out they've been moved 200 miles away to a new facility and nobody was told and all that. So family can't even get in contact with them. They can't get in contact with any legal support, that sort of thing. So if the system were administered in the way that it's supposed to, that we're being told that it is, maybe we'd be having a slightly different conversation right now. But a lot of the reason that people are so moved by this issue and so want to create systems of protection for folks facing deportation is because we just don't trust that they're going to get a fair shake. Immigration courts are also extremely backed up. There's only 3 judges in the state of Michigan, I believe, who can hear these cases, and they're scheduled out to 2021 at this point. You know, so it's just the system is broken, I think it's fair to say. And that's where, if there's not a, like, you know, really clear way to go about it, law enforcement has taken it into their own hands on multiple occasions and taken steps that have not been considered lawful by a lot of legal advocacy groups, which is why, again, we've seen this outpouring of support from congregations and so on.
What about those children that were separated and all that? If that would fall under this whole
Yeah,
umbrella.
so many parents have been deported
Right.
with their children still being held
Right.
in the United States. So those would be great candidates for sanctuary. Unfortunately, in a lot of the areas where they were and so on, they didn't have that option. They weren't here in Southeast Michigan. But those are the type of people who would go in sanctuary to at least say, until I get my child back, don't deport me.
So if it's a sanctuary city, and some, I don't know how it works, but if someone said, you know, these 5 children are gonna live in this, not even a church, let's just say they're gonna live in our house, all right? Does that mean that the sanctuary city, the police department in that city, does not break down the door of our house and take those children?
Yes, it just means that the city has made a decision to not allocate resources towards that work. So they're making sure that their law enforcement is focused on their priorities.
But it doesn't stop ICE from.
It doesn't
Correct.
stop ICE. And the
Correct.
state of Michigan, the entire state is within 100 miles of an international border. So border control can go anywhere in the state of Michigan, ICE can go anywhere in the state of Michigan, so on. Also, individual residents, it's much easier to get a warrant, and again, they don't have that policy of not getting a warrant and going in and pulling somebody out, so putting somebody in a personal residence does not provide the same amount of safety as putting them inside a church. Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and step a little bit into, again, this question of, as Christians, what's our responsibility in this? So it's not just been Christians that have been providing sanctuary, it's also been Jews, Muslims, Buddhists. I think really cool in Ann Arbor we have Genesis, which is Temple Beth Emeth and St. Clair, and they've become a sanctuary, sort of joint congregation in their building, so that's a really cool place to see some collaboration between people of different faiths around this issue. But Christians have a particularly long history with sanctuary. The term sanctuary even is sort of a Christian piece of terminology. So up here right now I have a couple of Bible verses that are often used by folks who are talking about sanctuary. Some are Old Testament, some are New Testament, some are very specific. Like the first one from Numbers is sort of about somebody who I think has committed involuntary manslaughter and trying to protect them from too harsh of justice, which I also will bring up is how a lot of people are addressing sanctuary. So sometimes it is that somebody has, you know, committed some type of infraction. They did not immigrate here in what we consider to be the correct way, but the punishment doesn't fit the crime. Sending them back to a place where they will almost certainly be killed is not justice. So that's some of the biblical background. And just in general, you know, these commands that we have to show hospitality, to treat strangers well. In reading some of the debate around the issue of sanctuary, you have a lot of, what I will say, very liberal Christians touting this and saying the Bible is very, very clear. We must provide sanctuary, you know, whatever. And then a lot of responses from more conservative Christians saying, hilarious that all of a sudden you are taking the Bible so literally, but normally you don't want us to do that. And I'll admit, when I was reading these debates, I was like, yeah, I don't really want to like set that precedent. I don't want to be hypocritical about it. I know Pastor Vicki gave a sermon just a couple of weeks ago about, you know, how we follow the law and that we do have to apply our own discernment when reading scripture. And so I don't want to just put up these Bible verses and say, you don't have a choice. You have to follow it because it's the law. So while I was sort of preparing for this, come on.
In a lot of cases, those passages need to be taken in context,
Exactly.
where if they are just pulled out for a specific reason, it's not always very valid.
Yeah. And so that's where I don't want to be guilty of doing that right now either. Those are lovely verses about showing hospitality, about welcoming strangers, and I really do believe in them. But also I was sort of trying to prepare. I started just asking myself, what's the overall theme of Christianity, of the New Testament? And I'm sorry, this is not loading. But I literally went to sparknotes.com, a website I'm decently familiar with, and SparkNotes the New Testament. So what are the main themes? What are the motifs of the New Testament? And it's not popping up, but salvation for social outcasts was the number one thing. People who are seeking sanctuary are people who have literally had to flee their own country. And again, there's a huge layer of politics behind that, of why they had to flee. There are a lot of misunderstandings about it, and I'm hoping that next week Marianne can share a little bit more. But when we have supported very brutal policies in other countries, and then won't respect that a person wants to leave because of those, it makes it really difficult to have this conversation. But these are people who we do have to recognize have felt very strongly compelled to take a very dangerous journey, to live again as social outcasts in this country, where they have to hide, where there's a fear of all these different situations happening. So salvation for social outcasts, for me, this checks the box. The second one, the theme that was sort of most prevalent, was faith in Christ. Salvation through faith in Christ.
Salvation for what?
Salvation through faith in Christ. And I think a person going into sanctuary is really putting themselves at the mercy of the people of Christ, the people of the church. To come in and say, I'm going to trust that you will care for me and you will watch out for me. So for me, it checks that box too. Sorry, didn't know what about it. So when it comes to the question of Christians stepping forward on this issue, obviously there's debate across the board, and there's no one clear answer. But that's sort of where my discernment personally has been in this, that there's plenty of scripture to back it up. But even without that, just the central themes of what we're called to do as Christians are to care for people who are in trouble. So we can nitpick the policies of it, but that's where I think I am. Anyone have additional questions, comments? Yeah.
Could I just make one point that I'm hard of hearing, so I might have missed something, but you'll have to excuse me if I do. But on an individual basis, this being in effect a good Samaritan and all this sanctuary on an individual level is fine, but the bigger picture, when you read things like in National Geographic or Time magazine a few months ago, long articles about all of just thousands of people that to go into South American and walk up all the way to the United States, and they're getting like 300 people a day coming in, and that's a completely different situation when you take it off the individual level. And there's so many people like in Germany that have changed their mind about being that they should throw their arms open to all the immigrants, and here they have tens of thousands of slum areas that then people are changing their mind about what the good policy is about immigrants. So I think the bigger picture is completely different than on an individual level.
I certainly agree that there are additional complexities, obviously, if you're a policymaker versus a congregation versus an individual. I would have difficulty saying they're completely different. Just because at the end of the day, what are we putting first? And for me, it's always human rights. So do we need actual long-term solutions? Yes. And is this an immigration policy sanctuary? No. This is not a sustainable immigration policy. So I think there are a lot of different components to what it is that you're talking about. Additionally, I'll mention, so Washtenaw Congregational Sanctuary was born out of WICR, which is the Washtenaw Interfaith Coalition for Immigrants' Rights, and the Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice's Latin American Task Force. The Latin American Task Force really tries to get at root causes additionally. So why are 300 people a day crossing the border? How are we contributing to the repair of Latin American countries and the things that are driving them up here? There's not going to be an answer to that tomorrow. But it's not just about assisting the people who have crossed our border, but really trying to make sure that this is not something that people are forced to do.
I mean, it is an excellent point. I mean, obviously, on one hand, we can't necessarily make our church the site for all refugees through the United States. I mean, obviously, we wouldn't have the capacity to do that. So I think everyone would appreciate the complexity or the impossibility of making our church or our community the site for all refugees around the planet. There isn't capacity to do that. But at the same, and so that it does speak to the broader immigration issue and how we handle that as a country. But at the same point in time, that also speaks to how our country sort of has policies that impact the livability in other places around the planet. So it is a very complex issue, but at the same point in time, how does that influence our ability to reach out to the person in need who's, you know, right around the corner? And I'm not saying it's easy, I'm just saying it's very complex. I mean, it's an excellent point.
Just to tag on to that, part of the reason that some of those countries were so inundated is because most of the rest of us didn't help. So take Germany, for example, they got tons of those Syrian refugees, but we didn't do anything to help the Syrian refugees. We closed our borders, and other countries in Europe closed their borders. So one country took an inordinate amount, and yes, those people that is not a happy situation there. But it is, I mean, I hear you, I think that's a valid concern, but I think part of what we need to do in our country is to do our part on all fronts. Sometimes we have to take in immigrants. Sometimes we have to work with other governments and figure out what the problem is. Sometimes we have to economically help out other countries. It's a big, huge thing. But we just can't put a blanket over our heads, and that's the problem.
And I think one of the things about congregational sanctuary that really resonates for me is it's extremely local. This is our neighbor, and we won't let our neighbor be sent to die. We won't let our families, our, you know, friends at school, their families get ripped apart. So there have been issues. I mean, community high school students who their dad was detained and, you know, different things like that. Like, these is a very local issue. I have a close friend who is a teacher, and a lot of the students get, who have parents who are undocumented, get phone alerts when there's ICE has been seen around the community. Because they want to make sure that their parents know, you know, don't go to the gas station on the corner of Carpenter or whatever, you know. So it's something that is just disruptive and traumatizing to children in our community who don't want to lose their parents. So this is really about caring for each other as well, just in our community. So it's not an answer to the immigration crisis, it's not an answer to everything, but it's saying these are our neighbors and we want to take care of them.
Well, one thing we can all do is vote for those who are willing to solve the more complex problems and support those countries in ways that will not make it necessary for people to walk thousands of miles to enter our borders.
I think it's begins the point of entry. The problem begins and needs to be organized at the point of entry.
I think it's very sad that we all have this local problem, but it's like a noise that hits and it just keeps going up like this. So our big problem isn't having a sanctuary church. Our problem is immigration and what are we going to do about it? And Marty's right. We got to get into politics.
We do.
That's it.
And I'll say it's very complicated. Like, so many of us, for some of us, our religion is public and our politics are private. And for some, our politics are public and our religion's private or whatever. And how we make our decisions, how we let our faith inform our political choices, it varies person to person. If some things, you know, I might have a personal stance on, but if it's a victimless crime, you know, I don't think that my values should get to dictate what the law is. If I do believe it's potentially a crime with a victim, you know, it's complicated. And same with immigration, that plenty of people sort of say, hey, like, my religion might be this, but I don't think that, you know, I believe in the separation of church and state or whatever. But at some point we have to allow our values to inform our voting. So,
As Christians.
yeah.
So think how, you know, again, if we were to be speaking about something a little bit different, say about housing, affordable housing, or we think about how we do outreach to the poor or those who are without food. You know, we could apply this same sort of what I would describe as paralysis logic, that if we solve all those problems locally, people from surrounding states or communities are going to migrate to this town, and we will be back to ground zero having to solve big problems. Yet, we rarely let those obstacles prevent us from acting to actually develop food pantries, you know, address affordable housing, you know, create utility assistance for those who have none. And so, you know, there is this sort of, again, this complexity that, you know, impacts a lot of these outreach kinds of efforts. But yet, for one reason or another, we have a greater paralysis around issues of, you know, immigration and refugees and so forth. At least that's the way it feels to me.
And a big component of Sanctuary is not that there are a long line of people waiting to go in. We have 12 congregations already in Washington County that have, in some level, signed on. We're unlikely to at any point have 12 people in Sanctuary. So will we ever, if we were to move forward with this, be called on to really house someone? Probably not. Some people, that's comforting. To some, it's disappointing that we won't get to actually move forward. But I think it's really about a stance of solidarity, that there have been a lot of narratives in the media that pick sides and that say that predominantly white Christian evangelicals, which we I guess are,
No, we're not.
no, we're not.
Don't say that.
Yeah, no, I know. But some people would put us into that group that we won't speak out on this issue and, you know, we won't address its complexity and that sort of thing. And so I think it's really powerful, especially when an institution like Zion, which is very large and very well known in the community, steps up and says, we're not going to let it be a black and white issue. You know, we're the bare minimum going to engage the conversation and try to recognize that first and foremost, a person facing a crisis like this is a child of God. And God is not an American. So that's not who we're here to enforce their, you know, agenda. We're here to enforce God's agenda in our own way to try to be compassionate in the community. So that's where I think a lot of the sanctuary congregation or the sanctuary conversation is just around making sure that people of faith are taking a stance and saying that these are our values.
Thank you, Emmeline. That was very well said.